no place. Ain't nobody cry.
Right on. You all can keep those greetings coming in. Keep acknowledging and sharing with us an ancestor or an elder that is inspiring your leadership. I'm going to invite everybody. I can't see you, so I don't know whether or not you're doing this, but I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath anyway. Appreciate you for whatever you had to do to make time to be in this important conversation with us. My name is LaShawn Routé Chatmon. I am the Executive Director of the National Equity Project, and I am your proud host today as we have a conversation about the role of racial affinity groups in supporting the development of Black teachers and teacher candidates, fostering teacher leadership, and building networks, and contributing to teacher well-being and sustainability. And one of the reasons that we invited you to start with naming an ancestor or an elder is to remind us, often as racial affinity groups do, remind us that we have historical guides. We have folks who have come before, right? And so we wanted for you to touch down and root in to this idea that we are already fully in the knowing, that people have already paid the price for our freedom. Sometimes racial affinity groups help us stand in that truth. So we have historical guides. One of mine is our patron saint, Harriet Tubman, right, who was not waiting for permission, waiting for any plans to get free. She imagined herself free, imagined her freedom, right? And then she and others in racial affinity and across racial affinity bent reality, right? And so we understand and tag back kind of in that Sankofa kind of way to the people who have come before to help us understand what to do. And Olivia, if you could advance this slide for me. Right. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams says it this way: our ancestors had to prepare themselves over and over again for moving toward a freedom that was nowhere in sight. We prepare for life as it unfolds, not our ideal image of it. That is literally the only path forward. An important element of this racial affinity space is deepening our consciousness and awareness of our ancestors and our elders, and helping us think through how we prepare for life right now as it unfolds. So we appreciate you being here. Next slide, please. Your host for today, I'll go from right to left on my screen. We have Sarah Gray, our Senior Director of Communications, who is supporting production, Olivia Yarborough, one of our BTP program managers, Dr. April Warren-Grice, who actually is responsible for this study that was commissioned, this landscape analysis, and is from Liberated Genius, Dr. Micia Mosely, who's our program director of the Black Teacher Project, and myself today, who'll be moderating a conversation. So my role here is simple. I'm just trying to get our space right so that we can move forward. We will hear from Micia next, who will provide an overview of Black Teacher Project and actually share the context and the why for why it was important for us to do this landscape analysis at this time. Sister April will come on and talk about the landscape process, an overview and some surprises or some insights. And then we'll have a moderated conversation and allow for some Q&A before we bring it to close. All right, Micia, over to you.
All right. And the person who you were just hearing from was LaShawn Routé Chatmon, the Executive Director of the National Equity Project. So I want to make sure we, give big thanks to the whole team for making this happen. And LaShawn, thank you for moderating today. So let me give you a little bit of background about the Black Teacher Project. For those of you who are not familiar, we are a program of the National Equity Project. And what we're really up to is changing the world, right? If you're on the Zoom, we assume you're about changing the world. So Liv, if you'll go to the next slide, I'll say more specifically how we aim to do that. So we really support Black teachers by develop and sustain themselves. So we support them, like we're developing, but they're also developing themselves to lead and reimagine schools as places of liberated learning. Now, what we mean when we say liberated learning, it's multifold. We mean learning where the folks in the process of teaching and learning feel liberated, but also the learning that you're doing is for your larger liberation. So it's both the process and the outcome as we think about it. And our vision is that every child would have access to the brilliance of the diversity and excellence and leadership of a Black teaching force. Whether you have a Black teacher specifically or not, we want you to be able to feel the impact of Black teachers. So part of that has to do with Black teacher leadership and really being able to share the wisdom and knowledge beyond just our particular classroom walls. So let's get into it a little bit with y'all. Let's bring y'all in the room and see what's going on with you. So Libby, can we get this poll going up for a sec? We want to know, have you ever had a Black teacher? Okay, so you should see a poll, yes or no. Have you ever had a Black teacher? And what we mean by this is in your formal education. Have you ever had a Black teacher? Yes or no? Go ahead and answer that poll. We'd love to get as many responses as possible. Have you ever had a Black teacher? Answer that yes or no. And Olivia, I think when we've got, a good percentage, we can go ahead and show those results. All right. So for those of you who replied, we've got 88% of folks who have had a Black teacher and 12% who haven't. So many of you will understand when we talk about wanting every child to benefit from the brilliance and excellence of Black teachers, many of you will understand what we're talking about, right? So we understand that it is a beautiful thing to actually have a Black teacher, but why? We may know that in our minds and in our hearts, but why? So I'd love for folks to take just a few minutes and get in the chat and answer this question. Any reflections you have about having the impact of having a Black teacher, or for the 12% of you who didn't have a Black teacher, what do you think the impact is of not having a Black teacher, right? So get us a little insight, the impact of having or not having a Black teacher. So let's get in that chat. We understand that we're in a context now where folks are really talking about diversifying the teaching force, that we need more Black teachers, but the why is so important. And we understand the importance having to do with representation. But as you all share in the chat, the impact goes beyond representation, right? As Mr. Breckenridge is saying, it's about empathy, right? It's really being able to connect that, that idea of having someone who looks like us, right? Being able to see ourselves is so, so important, right? But we also know about that history of being a warm demander, right? Where I'm going to love you like you are my own, but you're going to get this learning now, right? And there's a particular way that Black teachers come and bring that energy. Now, we're not trying to make it up that all Black teachers are perfect, but we understand that power, right? I love this, right? Michelle Phillips says that Mr. Ash helped me cut through the BS and see the narrative I had been told about who was good at math. Think about how many of our babies across race, right, particularly when we think about young women, are being told a false narrative. So at the Black Teacher Project, and thank you for continuing to add, I invite you all to look at what folks are writing. I'll use that to really say a little bit more about why we are doing what we're doing at the Black Teacher Project. So I've shared with you our mission currently, but we've actually shifted our mission and our vision, and it has a lot to do with that comment around lifting the narrative, right? And so we understand that to have Black teachers or other teachers of color in classrooms is extremely important, but folks need to be in classrooms with a purpose. And part of that purpose is transforming the school systems as we understand them. And so when we think about retaining or sustaining teachers of color and Black teachers specifically, this is not so that you can be sustained in an inequitable system and then support young people in getting through that inequity, and then some of them being sustained all in that inequity. That's not what we're up to. We're up to transformation. So when we talk about reimagining schools, we know that in order to transform, we have to see something new. And often we have to see something that doesn't currently exist. So that shift from where we were in the beginning of the Black Teacher Project, which was really about sustainability, retention, holding on to folks, has really moved to let's make sure that people have the skills and the knowledge and the capacity to actually be able to create the change that we want. We understand that that means being able to really understand the history of where we've been and understand what's happening in the present moment. And when we have those moments that snap us into an understanding, we've got to make meaning about what's going on. And our colleague Greg Peters has a theory of transformation where he talks about making meaning in 3 important ways. And that's really how I want to help us situate this conversation around affinity. So he talks about making meaning alone, right? You got to, especially when we're talking about racial equity, read a book, meditate, journal, do your work. When people talk about doing your own work, that's that alone work that only you can do with you and your inner self. We all must make meaning in those ways. But we know it's also important to make meaning in affinity with folks who are like us. Schools are organized by affinity, whether that's grade level, right? At a certain age, we think you should be about this age and in this grade. So we have elementary and high schools and secondary and all of that. We've got departments. Affinity is a natural part of how this school system was set up. And it's really important to understand that's one of the key ways that we make meaning. Now, what happens is when we talk about racial affinity, it gets a little spicy, right? After the summer we had, after the year we had in 2020, more and more people are talking about the importance of racial affinity groups. But it's important that when we do that meaning making in affinity, it is meaning making with a deeper purpose, right? Because what we want to do in that third piece is come together across difference, is really being able to shore ourselves up in affinity and then say, let me understand, let me learn from people who are different from me, right? So you may have in a high school, the first year students and the seniors learning different things in different ways, but there's a way that they all come together across difference. So we may have that grade level affinity and then we come across difference together to learn. But when we think about affinity groups, they must have a purpose in making meaning that goes beyond simply venting, which is what we see in a lot of affinity groups. And at the Black Teacher Project, we really aim to move to a place where we're able to focus on really 3 pillars. We focus on leadership, we focus on self and community care, and we do all of this with a foundation of Black love. And so for us, our professional development is rooted in that Black love and is going to support teachers not only in taking care of themselves and their community, but also in leading that change. So when we're coming together in affinity, we're doing that with a purpose, with an intention. And so we looked out and we said, okay, we know what we're doing, but what is everybody else doing? What's really going on? What is the history that we are standing on? Because we know we are not the first group to think about racial affinity for Black teachers. And so we have to also learn from our history, right? As LaShawn said in the beginning, bringing us in, rooting us in those who came before. So we said, all right, we know what we're doing. We know what a few other groups are doing, but let's really learn from one another and get an understanding of what are folks doing and why are they doing it and how are they doing it? So we wanted a landscape analysis that would allow us to understand what was happening with racial affinity groups for Black educators in a way that would allow us to bridge, to build bridges. So part of what happens in this, I'm trying to be thoughtful. I'm just going to say, you know, in this 21st century way that we get down with nonprofit change, right? It's like, I got the solution, right? At the National Equity Project, that's not how we get down. And that's not how we get down with the Black Teacher Project. We know that we are on a path and we are not on a path alone. And so we're constantly looking for ways to collaborate, to work with others, to be able to push our work forward. So if we want every child to benefit from the brilliance of a Black teaching force, we have to get with other Black teachers and other organizations that are supporting people in racial affinity, because we understand that in a context where critical race theory is being attacked, as we're on this very webinar, where thousands, millions of people are standing against equity and justice, that we have to come together to not only make meaning, but to be able to take action. And so we were excited to partner with Liberated Genius to be able to learn about what other folks are doing, but also learn the historical underpinnings of Black education, of racial affinity work in this country, so that the transformation that we seek can be deeper and we can go further, because we know that we can do that more together than we can alone. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. April Warren-Grice to let us know a little bit about just where we've been and what this process has been like. And as I turn it over, I would just want to offer gratitude, gratitude, gratitude for your work, for your brilliance, for your effort. Thank you so much in supporting us in our learning with this.
Micia, before you get off, real quick, can you, when did you decide, when was this teed up to this grant to do this project? Like what year?
Oh, I'm going to say 2019.
2019.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So just want to hold that for a second. Thank you. And first, thank you, LaShawn. Thank you, Micia. Like this work, the work that you all are doing is, I gotta be honest, when I saw the call for it, my friend sent it to me, and when I saw the call, I was like, oh, that's me. Like I knew it, like that was in my heart of hearts. I had no question about it. It was me, because the intention behind the work for collaboration, to do this not in silos, not in isolation, but to do this together, to find out who's also doing this work so that we can work together, because we're bigger, faster, stronger together than we are by ourselves. There's the African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. It just called and spoke to my heart. So, and I must say, just in thinking about the process of this, when I spoke to those who I interviewed, which I will get into in just a moment, I gotta say, it was like just meeting old friends. It was just like meeting people that like we all shared the same vision. Like we all were seeking justice. We all were seeking transformational education. And literally, like on most of the calls that I took, I said, listen, at the end, I said, I hope you know, ain't no breaking up. We go together. We building together, okay? Because again, we can do so much more together. All right, so go to the next slide. Thank you. Now, Micia, I asked the question, when did this get teed up? When did the grant come out and you start to do this? And you said 2019. So in 2018, Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker's book came out. Her book is called The Lost Education of Horace Tate. And in that book, she chronicles how Black educators in the South were key hidden figures in the fight for the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case. And most of the time when we think about that case, most people think of, okay, they think about the lawyers, they think about the parents, and they definitely think about the kids and the Little Rock Nine, okay? That's what we think about when those students were facing that mob trying to get into school. But most people don't realize, and most even historians didn't realize until Dr. Siddle Walker's work, is that it was because of the teachers, as civil rights attorney Oliver Hill stated, it was the teachers that undergirded those efforts, because the secret activism of Black educators, they worked with the NAACP to do one, discuss the needs and concerns of students in schools. Two, they helped to identify the students and the families who would be willing to testify. And then 3, they provided the money and the data to generate the case. So the reality is, without those hidden provocateurs, which is what they call themselves, we may not have even had that case. And so I start there because this is the point of departure for this report. And as LaShawn stated at the beginning, we have a history that we can go back to, that we can lean on. We have ancestors, like we have a playbook that was already written. And so most recently, as of like last week, I was in Hilton Head, South Carolina. And as I was walking, now we got chased by alligator, but that's another story for another day. But as we were walking through trying to get to a destination, all I could see were trees and trees and trees. And if you've ever been to the South, you know what I'm talking about. Those trees are just everywhere. It's just massive. And all I could think about was, how in the heck did Harriet Tubman take folks from here? Because she met in Hilton Head, South Carolina. She met with those enslaved Africans. How did she take those folks from there north? It just blew my mind, without a blueprint. And here I am with a GPS, right? And so what I'm saying is, we have a blueprint. We don't have to, we can all strive to be my auntie, my grandmother, Harriet, but we have a blueprint. We don't have to start from scratch. And so the Georgia Teachers and Education Association, they started this work. They started that advocacy work. So they focused on 3 things. Those educators in the pre-Brown, they focused on aspiration, advocacy, and access. They met locally, regionally, and nationally. And when they focused on aspiration, what they were thinking about was that they wanted to help their students to become full citizens, reaching their highest potential. They focused on advocacy for equitable rights, hence Brown v. Board of Education. But then they also focused on access to educational opportunities, new textbooks, buildings, transportation, equipment, playgrounds, you name it. They focused on all of those things. And so with Brown versus Board of Education, what happened is, now, what they thought they wanted, or excuse me, what they thought they would get was an additive model, but instead they didn't get that additive model. And so with the loss of the Black educators, over 40,000 Black educators were lost. What happened was Black students, communities, families, we lost our advocates. We lost that aspirational teaching. And so what the racial affinity groups for today, what they're doing is they are building on the works of the Georgia Teachers and Education Association. They're building on that foundation that was started way back then. And so, next slide, please. What excites me is that when I began to do this work, I found over 200 organizations across the United States. And I even talked to somebody from the UK. Right? And there are more that I hope to gather from around the world. But specifically US, there are over 200, which you can find at liberatedgenius.com in the directory, because I want you to know who I found, because they're amazing people. As I said, ain't no breaking up, right? And so the highest number was in California with 24. I think New York was next with like 19. Missouri came in with 10, but they're all across the board. And as far as even Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And when I interviewed 101 of those leaders, I wanted to know who was doing this work, how were they doing it? And then I said, well, what are the teacher needs and what are the organizational needs? And finally, I said, you know what? Do you know of any other organizations? So next slide, please. Now, when I talked to these leaders, it just blew my mind, because it literally, they were doing the exact same things those educators were doing pre-Brown versus Board of Education. They were in direct alignment with the work of that Dr. Siddle Walker chronicled in that book. And if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, I think we should all encourage Ava DuVernay to do Hidden Figures on these educators, because the book, the way that she describes this work is amazing. So getting with, so thinking about the work that these groups and how they're operating today is, one, they gather for what I term racial wellness support. Because if you think about how, right now, one of the buzzwords is social emotional learning, we need to think about the social and emotional well-being of our educators of color, because they're often working in racist school environments, because that's essentially how they were built. And so they meet for this racial wellness support, which There is, which they can gain inspiration and empowerment. There's fellowship and networking, understanding, navigating, and negotiating racial and racist issues. But then they can do the real work, because really when they gather for that racial wellness support, that's really just to set them at ground zero, just to even set their body, right, for wellness, so they can actually teach and be educators, but then also so that they can do the work for educational justice, which is for that aspiration, advocacy, and access. Next slide, please. What I want to do now is just highlight some of the organizations. And this slide will show some of the long-standing racial affinity groups, such as the National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa, which was actually founded in 1923. I had no idea that they who they were, and that they are still in existence, right? And then we have the National Alliance of Black School Educators, founded in 1971, right after the dismantling of the Georgia Teachers and Education Association. Because what happened with that organization is that they ended up merging with Georgia Education Association. So then we have this National Alliance of Black School Educators. But then there's NPEACE in 1996 from Hawaii. They're doing some amazing work. And then there's a Black Education Network in 2001. And I highlight these organizations because, again, we don't have to start from scratch. No one has to start from scratch. We got blueprints made. We have blueprints made. Next slide, please. One of the highlights, actually, just to go back to NPEACE real quick, is that in order to increase their teacher education pipeline, what they're doing, if you are an employee of one of their programs, they pay you to go back to school and to get a degree. So they provide financial assistance, but then they provide support with the staff by allowing 4 hours per week for professional development to use to be concentrated on homework. I just thought that was phenomenal. So you're gonna pay me to do my homework to get a degree to become a teacher? I just thought that was phenomenal. Then looking in schools, the Kirkwood School District, they have a couple of things that really, that I felt just blew my mind. I hadn't seen it elsewhere. One is that they actually get a racial affinity release time to build their work. And not just to build their work. So they get to design whatever they want to do, but also they provide professional development for the entire district. So they may have like a racial equity day. And so I think it was a couple of months ago, they had one where they were focusing on Black girls, and that was open to the entire district. But then something else that they have is that they have a teacher of color rep, which is similar to a union rep. And so they will sit in on those meetings to act as a voice and to make sure that those voices are heard. So then moving on to the Boston Public Schools, they had something that was freaking phenomenal as well. I mean, really, you're gonna hear me say that about every organization. I want to highlight everyone, but I only get 10 minutes, so thanks a lot, Micia. All right, but the Boston Public Schools, what they have is they have an 8-month leadership program, and anyone is open to attending those, applying and entering those programs. And they've had movement as high as, so there was lateral movement into leadership positions, but then there was some even high as reaching assistant superintendent. So I thought that was pretty phenomenal. Next slide, please. 2 other organizations, and these are outside of the schools. And so when I say outside, I'm thinking like nonprofits or LLCs, but the Association of Araza Educators, one, they have the Praxis Institute, which is not social justice 101. So that's for people that's really they've done their own work. They did their own homework, and now they're really deepening their work. But then they have the liberatory pedagogical frameworks. And an example of that is, there were students that complained that their parents were being harassed as street vendors. And they asked their teachers, what can we do and how can we organize? And in doing that, the teacher went to the Association of Araza Educators, and the association helped the teacher to create an entire curriculum for that class. That right there, now that's work right there, right? Then there's also the Center for Black Educator Development. Now they're doing some great work. I mean, when I'm talking about building this pipeline, they are starting with dual enrollment for high school and college students. They can become serve as apprenticeships and mentorship programming for college and high school students. But then they also have the opportunity to receive scholarships from partnering universities. I thought that was just phenomenal. They're also working with the government to increase their entire ecosystem, which is now then trying to be is often, excuse me, not often, but other institutions outside of where they are located, which is in Philadelphia, they're trying to replicate what's going on in Philadelphia. Next slide, please. So then these are three organizations. I had to highlight them. They are not necessarily in the physical report, but they are in the directory, which you can again find at liberatedgenius.com, because again, it's over 200. You need to look at them. But I highlight them because they're doing they're again also doing amazing work. So Shifting Powers, which is Remake Learning and University of Pittsburgh, they pair Black and Latinx educators with researchers to do a research project of the practitioner's choice. So it makes them the lead learner. It makes them, it positions them in a position of power, shifting that power. Then the Latinos for Education, they have a virtual summer leadership collaboration, which is paid, which is awesome. And they have an edupreneur pitch competition, which I didn't hear out of the rest of the organizations, which I thought was phenomenal. The National Indian Education Association, they have a cultural repository. Talk about preserving the culture and then being able to tap back into it. That right there, I thought was phenomenal. Next slide, please. So I know I'm coming to a close. I probably have my 10 minutes already. So I'm just gonna highlight here some of the organizational teacher needs. The teacher needs, the number one thing that everybody said was they need these schools not to be racist. They need them to be anti-racist, anti-bias, and inclusive and nurturing places for people of color. That was the number one thing. They also wanted racial wellness support. I'm gonna move over to the organizational needs just for the sake of time. The number one across the board was philanthropic support with a racial equity and racial justice lens. And what that really means is understanding that we didn't get here in a day, and solving these issues isn't gonna take a day. And so philanthropists need to understand that and to bake that into their funding models. So next slide, please. The number one lesson that I took away from this was just that we need to, as LaShawn started us off with, we need to be able to look back. We don't have to start from scratch. We have blueprints, we just need to use them. But not only do we have blueprints, we need to consider how they worked. That means we must collaborate, strategize, and mobilize together. If they could get the Brown v. Board education, if they were the linchpins for that, like, just imagine how much more powerful we could be if we work together. Again, 200 organizations listed in it, I'm just saying. And what I've heard from funders is they actually support they are more willing to support organizations that come together. So that's also a thing to think about. So the lesson forward, collaboration. And with that being said, so the number one, not the number one, I've heard lots of number ones, but one of the things that I heard from most, if not every organization, they said, well, we can't wait to find out who else is doing this work so that we can collaborate. So next slide. And so with that being said, one of the things that is going to be coming soon is going to be the soundboard. It's going to be a place for leaders of education-based racial affinity groups, where we can come together and figure out how to build together. We can work smarter, not harder, because Mr. Miyagi said that, and I'm one of his students, right? We can work smarter, not harder. We can learn from each other, because what Micia has, I don't have. What I don't have, she has. What LaShawn has, and vice versa. We can build together, all right? So with that being said, that was essentially the report in a nutshell. I'm really excited about this, and I'm just excited to engage with you all more about this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister April. So we are we're gonna have a little moderated conversation here. We want to just keep going with all of that good energy and information and data you were bringing forward, April. And I wanna ask both of you first, actually, just kind of aspirationally, what are you hoping? What are each of you hoping the people on this call actually do with this information? So what's a hope that you're holding? April, I heard you as we closed about, as you closed, that radical collaboration is one of the aspirations of this report. But Micia, I want to give you an opportunity to say, what are you hoping folks will do? with
Yeah,
this.
I hope folks will also learn about the history. I think we are ahistorical in this country, and that is a challenge. So understand that this analysis isn't, the directory is one piece where you can find out where everyone is. But when you see, for those of you who haven't seen, when you see the full report, what April just said is in the report in terms of putting it in historical context, and share that history. I don't know what happens with the history of education and teacher prep, but I feel like it's gone away. And so I feel like folks need to understand the histories that we come from. The other thing is that people will get ideas about what's possible in racial affinity groups. And so again, I think we're in a moment right now where, I joke that people, found out about racism last year, right? Just hot off the press, this was going on. And so now it's like, oh, we need racial affinity groups in our district, in our school, in our organization. And my fear is that folks are being harmed because when you are, and I think this is often true in my experience with restorative justice as well, folks take something that works in a particular context and without doing it with fidelity, it gets misused. And so my hope is that people will learn about the different things that you can do and the ways that you can use racial affinity groups to create change, not simply to pacify educators of color, because that's what I see happening in too many districts. Folks can get together. This is about creating, providing resources in terms of space, time, and money, space, time, money, for folks to actually be able to create change.
Right on. There it's a bunch of testifying that has been going on in this chat. This chat is our jam in this webinar modality, so y'all keep that coming. Can we make sure that we actually have the analysis, the report in the chat, so that folks who haven't been able to access it have it before they leave the call? So I want to actually build Micia, on your reference to this moment, right? Because April, what you so powerfully did was locate the role and work of racial affinity groups in a historical context, right? We're in a very, very particular moment, a moment that has shifted even from April when you got started, right? And so one question that I have is what does the analysis and the data from this report suggest about what Black teachers in particular can and should be doing when we find ourselves in a moment of white backlash, attempts to maintain racial hierarchy by banning young people from knowing the truth and the histories about themselves? Like, we're in a very particular moment right now. So what does all of what we have learned suggest about what Black teachers need and perhaps an agenda that we need to be about right now?
For me, one of the things, so at first, when I first, was doing it, I was just excited, like, oh my God, we just need to do what they were doing back then. Yeah, like we just need to. And I'm reminded of the second to last slide that I had, and it was a quote by Dr. Siddle Walker. And she says, a main component is to understand the value of quiet collaboration and careful organizing.
Yeah, right on.
So, and I think that, like, that's not new. Like, I mean, most people on this call, if they've been doing this work, they've probably been doing some quiet collaboration just with the people that they work with, even in their own school districts or their own school. Even in my own research, those educators, they mentioned always, like, they didn't trust everybody with all the information. They only use on a need to know basis, and everybody didn't need to know. And then once they galvanized and strategized and brought that information together, then they went forward and moved. And so I think it's important to learn that, we need to collaborate, to come together with like-minded individuals with that liberatory approach, with that same vision, with that Harriet Tubman mentality. But we need to really operate in silence before we just start saying everything. But then I also think that we can learn from that, and thinking about it is that we need to be strategic in how they did it, and thinking about legislation and actually partnering with folks that are not educators. So back then they worked with the NAACP, they worked with everybody. They worked with lawyers, you name it, to actually create momentum. Because again, educators, we only know so much. We know we're experts in the field of education, and that's perfectly fine. But we don't know the law side, or we need to get like with Stacey Abrams, like, you know how to organize, right? So we need to get with Stacey Abrams, right? We need to just, that quiet collaboration and strategic work. I think that is the thing that we need to take from this in order to do this advocacy work for transformation. And like Micia said earlier, recognizing that it's not just a venting session. Now that will happen because we need to get it out, right? We have to get it out. But then we need to get it out for the purpose of movement. I'm going to pass the mic to Micia.
I'm going to do a quick ditto and just kind of highlight the policy and active advocacy implications. So what I'm hoping is that folks, there's a section of the report where we're often asked, especially in February, people come knocking at the Black Teacher Project's door, and I'm sure many of the groups in this report, and say, can you help us get more Black teachers? To which I always said, I don't know unemployed Black teachers. Folks have jobs. There's teacher shortage. Why should they come to your school? And so in this report, one of the pieces of research that we highlight is Dr. Rochelle Rogers-Ard's work around retaining teachers of color and Black teachers in particular. And so she talks about what it means from a policy side to remove some of the barriers. She talks about having focused placement of teachers. So I hope when people read this, one, that people read it, right? It's one thing to go to the directory and say, well, who's near me? But it's a whole other thing to actually read, what are we saying about the experiences of teachers of color and what it will take to actually support the transformation that we're capable of. So I really hope that folks will pay close attention to the policy and advocacy piece, because when you are engaged in racial affinity work, that's why I showed that slide with the 3 A's. Part of it allows us to come together across difference. Last thing I'll say is that I hope that people will pay attention to the notion of building community and love in the space, because often racial affinity groups disintegrate when they have no purpose. People stop coming because it's a venting session. But when you have a clear purpose of building community, we've got some internalized oppression that we need to heal from. And we don't need to talk about that with folks who are not in that oppressed group, right? And so only, I'm not saying that we don't ever have those, but we don't only. So part of it is not just like, woe is me, the man's got me down. It's also like, how can we do some healing intergenerationally? What you'll see in many of these groups is, our teachers of color, our numbers are skewing young, because as people are retiring, we're doing a good job of recruiting folks, but folks aren't staying in the game.
Yeah, right on.
Who's got 10 years on it anymore?
Yeah.
So just recognizing that need for that community building within.
Yep. Micia, I'm asking you to go a little bit further on that, because there were definitely some comments in the chat earlier on about racial affinity groups that some of our participants are in saving their life. So give us some examples of the ways that Black Teacher Project actually protects the emotional and psychological health and well-being of Black teachers. Talk about what you all do to sustain Black teachers in the work.
So much of it has to do with reminding folks that they deserve to be human. They are human beings, right? And that they're more than their labor. So part of what we understand is like our role as Black teachers is specific, but we are human beings first and foremost. And that folks come from a legacy. Our programming always, and we'll have a moment when we close today, we always include some experience of self-care, self and community care. And we talk about self and community care as a professional practice. So now mindfulness is getting, all this stuff that we've been talking about for decades in the last 5 years is starting to pop. So for us, we integrate it. So yes, we are going to do your inquiry project where you bring student work and we talk about what's happening with you pedagogically, but we're also going to talk about how you are reducing stress so that you can show up, and not as a list of good ideas. For example, in our fellows community last year, we had a self-care tracker. You know, there's trackers for all these things relative to academics. We're like, how much water did you drink? What's your self-care goal? Let us support you in that as a community of fellows. So whether it's the practices within professional development or the longer term support and accountability around self-care, we believe that you must structure it in order for it to be something other than a conversation. We spend a lot of time talking about self-care, but actually engaging in the practices along with the intellectual is part of how we support the folks in the Black Teacher Project.
Right on, right on. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I see some questions coming up in the chat and in the Q&A. So you all can feel free, if you have some specific questions for Dr. Warren-Grice or Dr. Mosely, please go ahead and put those there. I want to ask the two of you, what are the implications for principals and other teachers of color, and or for principals and teachers who are white? What do you want them to know? Because you've implied some things that I want to make sure folks have heard. So what do you want them to know?
Go ahead, Micia.
Okay, you already know me. I got a lot. So first off, racial affinity groups will not end racism alone. Okay, so let's stop with the quick fix. This is not the latest quick fix, right? So racial affinity groups, I want to put it in context of folks have to do their alone work, and we've got to do work across difference that is about building allyship. And you're building allyship around the truth. So first and foremost, for positional leaders, principals, know the truth of what is happening. Know that we are up to fighting something that is pervasive. I think for white educators, there are racial affinity groups for white educators. Get yourself in one. And so it is so important that we happen to be talking about Black teachers specifically in the Black Teacher Project and teachers of color more broadly in this report, but this work is important for everyone. So that idea of the alone across in affinity and across difference, Greg Peters is a white guy, right? And he can see the importance of that in part because of the longstanding work that we've done. I would also say, get thee some help. And one of the places, if you are, if you're really about that life, come to the National Equity Project, but you got to be about that life because we're not trying to play games, right? So the folks who were thinking about the possibility of like maybe someday working toward equity, there are other orgs that can support you to get your mind right. But when you're ready to do the work, don't do it alone, right? And so as a site leader, when you are a principal, there's so much that you're charged with. So when we think about this report, working toward policy, support your teacher leaders in truly being leaders. So we talk about in the Black Teacher Project, leading from the classroom. We've got to get out of these siloed roles. Principals, co-teach a class, get back in there and understand what is needed, and allow the folks who are charged with classroom teaching to be leaders, which means listening to them when it comes to policy, listening when it comes to structural change. And so those groups, I feel like, get yourself your own support for your own work in affinity, but also how to think about how we're shifting power in the places where we lead.
Right on.
I'd like to add, just in thinking about some of the principals, administrators that I've worked with, white administrators that I've worked with, and they want to do it. But just knowing it's going to be difficult, right? Knowing it's going to be difficult and still willing to do that. And remembering the purpose for racial affinity groups. So like Micia said, one, our white educators, they need to be in white racial affinity groups so that they can learn about their biases. They can learn about their own stuff, right? And they can learn how to be an ally and how to be a co-conspirator so that they can process their own stuff. But then also to remember that the purpose is not just for that, but instead it is actually to transform the systems that we are in. Because I've worked with some districts and they have these groups for both people of color and white folks. And it really is more of that venting. And they're doing some processing, and that's great. But there is no transformational activity that's happening as a result of that. They are not, there's not that planning process. There's not that strategic planning process to make change in the district. Because sometimes what I found too often is that, some of these good schools, they're doing some great work. They earned their diversity badge, okay? They've accomplished it, okay? They know what they're doing. But the reality is we are all on a journey. Even people of color are on a journey as we unlearn some things. Everybody is unlearning. So it's not just white folks, it's everybody has to, because we all swim in this dirty water. Yep. And that's what we have to remember. And so what I encourage our white administrators and just administrators in general is that to remember the purpose. Yes, it's for, learning about ourselves and, how we can do things individually, but the larger picture is for systemic change, for transformation. So that would be my my hope and aim and goal and desire.
Right on. There was a lot of testifying in the chat going on as you were naming that folks actually have to have an intention that's larger than Black folks or folks of color coming together in affinity to be all right with the inequitable conditions that they're sitting in, right? So name an intention, right? And that intention has to be about changing structure and transforming your community. Right on. There were two questions that came up in the chat. Yeah. One is from Mr. Breckenridge, who asked, how can we engage our Black parents to build community? How can we support other Black professionals?
So, go ahead, April, go ahead.
Yeah, I just spoke last, you go first.
So partnering is one. Because there are a number of parent-led organizations that are often, and I'm not talking about the school's PTA necessarily, but community-based organizations. So find out who they are. So in the Bay Area, for example, Plan is one that we'll be partnering with for Black to School Night in the fall. Stay tuned for our
I heard that.
Black to School Night, where we're going to be inviting parents of the students that our teachers teach to be in conversation. So we need to listen to parents. Partnering, one of the first steps is listening, but also supporting folks to get organized in that. I'm going to do a little quick double duty because I saw another question that I wanted to address, which was about what I'm calling release time. And I think it can go with this, right? Someone was saying, like, we're trying to do all this work on top of our full-time responsibilities. One of the other things that site leaders can do is support teachers in having the resource of time. Now, maybe you can't do a full release period, but think about how you might organize some release time for folks to partner with parents, to plan racial affinity groups. How do you make this part of your professional development time? So I just wanted to say those things, because whether you're talking about having the time to do this for teachers or partner with parents, we've got to restructure. And that is what we're talking about in terms of systems change. We've got to restructure how we're doing what we're doing to support this work.
Yeah, let's talk about reimagining. Okay, I'm here for it. I hope I get to answer this question too. And I love that idea of release time, which is why I mentioned that Kirkwood School District, they actually do that. One thing that I did in my own organization for this event, and it was by accident, because I was trying to have an event for some Black young geniuses and to celebrate them. And I was like, dang, how am I gonna get them there? And I was like, oh, I guess I need to have something for the parents. And so what I did was I had two meetings going on simultaneously. They came in together, we had a great opening. Students were here, the parents were here. And it was great. What happened was, I'm over here with the students, they having a good time. I was like, oh, let me check on these parents. And what happened was, because I had a couple of leaders, parent leaders, to give a couple of presentations. And what happened was, when I went over there, they were like, so when is the next meeting? I was like, wait a minute, hold up. This was not even for you. I used you to get to the students. But what that showed me is that these parents were fully engaged. And so if you partner and have something for both groups, for the students and the parents simultaneously, that is of value to both groups, then it can be a highly beneficial practice. So one of the things that I hear educators saying, well, how do we get the Black parents to come? You know, they never come, they only come to the basketball game. Well, it's because their kids are involved. So if you know that, then how about you work smarter, not harder, as Mr. Miyagi said, and have something for both groups simultaneously. And that way it can be a much more powerful and robust opportunity for all around.
Right. Having meaningful things to do, transforming a little bit of power, right? That they're actually not just being invited there to listen to something that we want them to do, but the parents have power. I appreciate that. That will be our last question. We are right at the top of the hour. Thank you all. You can put some love and appreciation in the chat on the outro. We'll play some music. You want to stay connected. Both to Liberated Genius and to the Black Teacher Project. You can hit us up on all these social media tags or visit our website for more information and ways that you can get involved. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. April Warren-Grice, becoming a family member of National Equity Project. Thank you so much for doing this work and blessing us. Micia Mosely, always, 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 sis. You all be safe out there and stay in good trouble. Hit it, Olivia.